everybody. This week we have yet another very, very special guest for you all. Everybody, welcome to the show, Tom Brevoort. Welcome, Tom.
Hey, Tom.
Hello, how you doing?
Good. How are you, sir?
I'm fine.
And I found this like digging in your history and all this. Is it true you've really edited over like 4,000 comics?
I haven't kept a count, but I've been doing it for 3 decades, so it's quite possible that's a number that's close to factual.
And I guess before we get into your origin story, like when you edit
What's the best one?
Yeah, no, I wasn't gonna say that. I was gonna ask like while you're editing a book, right? I mean, you've done so many now that it's like, do you know when something's going to be like a big hit? Like when you're editing something, you're like, oh man, this is going to be something special compared to like, I not to put any other books down, but like you can, like, oh, this is going to be like something that people are going to talk about for a while.
Honestly, the answer there is sometimes.
Yeah.
There are certainly plenty of books that I've put out that I've thought, man, I really like this. I think this is great.
Mm-hmm.
And the response from the audience at large has been, that's all right.
Really?
And there have certainly been books I've put out where I've gone, this isn't so good. And the response from the audience has been, this is cheese and crackers.
Yeah, right.
So the reality is, if we knew exactly what was going to work every single time, that's all we would do. We wouldn't bother with the other stuff. It's
right.
The fact that we don't know necessarily 100% what's going to work and what's not going to work that keeps it all interesting.
Yeah. I guess it makes sense. You can't really always speak for the people on that stuff and what their taste is. But all right, let's hear the origin. I know you've probably told it so many times, but I mean, it all started with the internship, right? And that's how you got your foot in the door at Marvel.
In terms of the Marvel stuff, yeah, I was an illustration major at the University of Delaware, and as part of that program, in your senior year, you had to serve an internship, and they had somebody, I don't know who it was, but they'd had somebody a couple of years earlier who'd interned at Marvel, so it was a thing that was a possibility and that they knew about, and I had been interested in doing comics since I was 6. And so, I sent outreach letters, not just to Marvel, but to pretty much everybody that was a publisher in 1989 that was within reach. And Marvel was the only one that got back to me, which is great. So I ended up interning there in the summer of 1989. And by the end of 89, I was on staff as an assistant editor, and I've kind of been around ever since then.
Wow. And I mean, of all the places to get back to, it was Marvel, right? Were you always more of a Marvel fan?
I've vacillated back and forth. For the first couple of years that I was a reader, as a relatively young child, I was a full-on DC fan, and I actively didn't like Marvel at all. To the point where, because in those days, I wasn't buying my own comics. My parents were effectively buying them for me. My dad was a heavy smoker, so we would routinely cruise down to like the 7-Eleven or a stationery store or something so that he could buy a carton of cigarettes, and sometimes he would just like run in and he would get me a comic, and every once in a while that would be a Marvel comic, and the Marvel comics of that period did not appeal to me at 6 or 7. And so I would tell him, fairly insistently, don't bring me Marvel books. Marvel books are stinky. They're bad.
That's awesome.
To the point where years later, when I started reading the Marvel books, he would give me grief about it.
Yeah.
And he died in the mid-'80s. He died before I got this job.
Right.
But he would have been relentlessly squeezing my shoes over the fact that I've been working for Marvel for 3 decades. That would have provided him with no end of enjoyment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that sounds a lot like my father.
That's awesome. That's amazing. That's what a story. And I guess like now you can say that you're editing the books that you would want to read, right? You have your hand in it, saying that like, okay, well maybe I would read these a little more than when I was 6 years old.
Well, yeah, I mean, I have a website where I've been going sort of chronologically through all the comics that I read, among other things, and talking about them good and bad, and looking back at them from a modern vantage point.
Right.
And the reality is, there was a lot that I found fault with as a young reader that was accurate, and there was other stuff that was just not aimed. It was not being pitched at me. Marvel Comics in 1973, 1974 wasn't really trying to get the 6-year-old crowd. And so a lot of the subject matter, a lot of the way they would pace stories, a lot of the way things were put together and done in that period, it wasn't designed for me at all anyway. And so the fact that I enjoyed Julie Schwartz's superhero comics, which were mostly stories in 14 pages that were very clean and very straightforward and simple, that's not at all mysterious to me. Whereas the Marvel books of the time were almost always continued, were almost always they had a tendency in that period, particularly in that period around 74 and 75, to make the cover the last page image, and that drove me bananas as a reader.
Yeah,
I hated that like crazy.
Yep.
Because, and I always do the hyperbolic version of it. If I bought this comic because, holy smoke, the Red Skull's throwing Captain America into a volcano. How is he going to get out of that? I gotta know. Here's my quarter. Quick, give me the comic. Yeah. And I'd read 17 pages, and on the last page, it would be Schweinhund. Now I will cast you into this volcano. And Cap would be falling in, to be continued. Yeah. And I'd be pissed. And I'd be pissed because as a young kid, you have no control over whether or not you're going to get the next issue or not.
Right.
I wasn't going or being bought comics on such a regular basis that I could feel like, well, I'm going to find out. Not only do I not know how Cap gets out of the volcano, I paid money for a ride, and I still don't know. So that sort of thing pissed me off on a number of occasions, enough so that like I was just not for a long time a Marvel reader.
Wow. Yeah, that's.
But then you grew up, and they got better taste. That's fine.
That's
you don't really have to sell me on the merits of Marvel Comics.
Yeah.
I think I've got that covered.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
So, let's get into the job a little bit. Like, what does an editor do at a company like Marvel? Like, what do you do on a day-to-day?
Well, a day-to-day is always hard to speak to per se, in that every day is different. But in principle, the way I describe this to people who are laymen like yourselves is, being the editor on a comic is like being the manager of a sports club. Like, I don't go out on the field and play the game, but I get to choose who does, and I get to choose what positions they play, and I can call for a specific play. I can change the team uniforms if I want. I can call for a pinch hitter or make a substitution. I can rotate somebody out when they're not throwing so well anymore, and put somebody else in. And I'm responsible for getting the club to the stadium on time and ready to play at the level that spectators are there to see every time. And ultimately, everything that happens, good or bad, mostly bad, is my responsibility.
Wow.
So when you see fan backlash, and this is something I really want to ask, because what I always see especially online and stuff like that is, oh, if only the editor didn't get in the way or something along those lines. How much of that is BS, or how much of it is just like the buck stops with me? I'm Tom, and I'm going to take responsibility for this.
Again, a little of each side. Like, there are basically two complaints that fans always voice about editors, and they're in complete opposition to one another. One is, why did the editor screw all this shit up? And the other is, why didn't the editor stop all this stuff from happening? So at the same time, fans want the editor to do a lot to make sure the comic is exactly the way they want it, but not to do anything that would interfere with the comic being the way that they want it. And some of that is just not knowing and understanding the realities of the gig, and some of that is just ultimately fans, readers, all they want is a comic that they like. They don't care about any of the other stuff. So are there editors that foul things up? Sure, there are. You bet. All the time. Does that mean that every idea or everything that a particular creator wants to do is the right or best thing? Absolutely not. The difference that I tell the younger editors, I do a class every year at Marvel now where I impart a whole bunch of concentrated ethos to the younger editors that we're bringing up, so that we have some sort of institutional memory at the place. And what I tell people essentially is the writer's first loyalty is to the story, whatever story they're trying to do. The editor's first loyalty is to the book. And the sort of obvious example to this is not every year, but every 2, maybe 3 years, like clockwork, somebody, some well-meaning and very energetic and very emotionally invested writer pitches the story in which Spider-Man, he's got his back to the wall, everything, the chips are on the line, and he's got no other choice, and he kills a dude. And every writer, one every couple of years shows up wanting to pitch that story, wanting to do that, and they've got every explanation for why this is going to be the greatest story, and everybody in the world is going to come out, it's going to win awards and so forth, and it never happens. Because those writers are not wrong. They've got a story they feel strongly about, that they believe in, and that they feel, but from my point of view as an editor, that does lasting damage to the character and to the book. And so I'm not going to let you do that one without a really good reason.
Yeah.
And so that's the back and forth of it. What do I want in my comics? I want the best comics I can get. I want the best stories. I want the best art. I'm always, looking and pushing for that. Every editor is. That said, every editor has a set of taste, and so exactly what I like is not exactly what Nick Lowe likes or Jordan White likes or whomever likes, and so there's going to be a range of stuff, and even then within the editorial hierarchy there are people that work for me. Will Moss is theoretically under me, and Will's tastes and perspectives are not the same as my own, so there are times when we might disagree on a particular point one way or the other, and that's all stuff that we talk through and negotiate out. And the same thing comes, with dealing with the individual creators. I don't put a writer on a book to write my stories. I want them to write their stories, and the whole reason that they're there is to do their stories. There's no point if I'm just going to write the comic. But that having been said, there are certainly guidelines and guide rails. And if you want to, color outside those lines, you'd better convince me that whatever we're going to attempt to do is a net positive, a net gain rather than a net loss. Because at the end of the day, my first loyalty is to the book, and I'm well aware at all times that while you may be the person writing Spider-Man this month, somebody wrote it before you did, and somebody's also someday going to write it after you. And the same is true with me if I'm happening to be editing Spider-Man. Somebody did it before I did. Somebody's going to have the gig after I'm done. And so, the editor has to take the long view on these things. It really is, difficult to break these characters that have been around for so many years. You can have up periods and down periods, but it's really, really tough to put a permanent dent in them. But every once in a while, it can be done. And so, you have a responsibility to watch out for that stuff and make sure these things are still in shape 10 years from now or 20 years from now, so the next generation of readers can experience and enjoy them the way we all got to.
And so, how much of the idea that fans have of like the rooms, like the Avengers room and the X room, and how much of that is real? And would you say you're in the Avengers room if it is?
I don't know how much, I don't know what the fans think necessarily, but
Yeah.
there is certainly like I'm a special case because I am a mighty long tenured editor, so I can put my hands in whatever I feel like it more often than not.
Yeah.
But theoretically, in general, I'm dealing with the Avengers sort of area of Marvel. And Nick Lowe is dealing with more or less Spider-Man and his cast, and Jordan White is dealing with more or less the X-Men, and then other editors in and around that are all doing stuff. In that, sometimes there's very tight coordination, particularly over the last year or two, since Jonathan Hickman started sort of uber masterminding the X-Men.
Yeah.
They have regular Zoom calls where all the X-Men editors call in and talk about whatever they're doing or whatever they're planning and bounce that stuff back and forth very very concretely with one another, so that there's a consistency across all those books, because they're all taking place on the same weird island, and they need that sort of consistency. In the case of the Avengers books right now, a couple of times a year we do a creative retreat, a creative summit, where most of our key creators get together. It used to be in person, but for the last year or two, it's been in Zoom calls and the like. That we talk about what stuff is coming up and what we're doing and so forth. But what that means in practical terms is, Jason Aaron writing Avengers isn't necessarily having a lot of regular conversations with Chris Cantwell, who's writing Iron Man, unless there's something that they happen to need or want to bounce off of one another, or they happen to be friendly off to the side, just as human beings who are going to interact and bounce things back and forth. So is there a lot of interaction? Yes, but it's not absolute one way or the other.
Okay. Interesting. And I guess for since you're someone who's been at Marvel for so long, the experience probably helps you. I mean, because you're editing within the story, and then you said when another writer takes over, but also the continuity of the characters as well, right? I mean, you have to kind of know your stuff when it comes to certain characters, or
you have to know at least the broadest stuff. Honestly, that's the thing that I would worry about the least. Hiring somebody in to edit a book. I'm not that. I'm more worried about them having storytelling chops, understanding how to put a story together, having good instincts as to who is talented and appropriate for a given assignment or not, and so forth. The history is something that can be learned, and the history is something that there's a bunch of different people that are around that can help fill in the gaps. Also, on a practical level, while every fan's experience is different, every event that's happened to Spider-Man over the last 60 years has happened, but not all of it is, forward-facing and important at any given point.
Okay.
Which is to say that if you're going to do a story next month in Spider-Man that slightly contradicts something from a story in 1972, I don't care. The amount of the audience that cares is so infinitesimal at that point.
Yeah.
That it's even though more of that material is more readily available, because a lot of it's been collected in trade paperbacks and is on Marvel Unlimited and so forth, but the fact that in 1972 Jerry Conway said, "Oh, Peter Parker is allergic to garlic, and in the latest issue you're going to have him eat a garlic pizza." Yeah. I don't care about that. What I care about is that Spider-Man is Spider-Man. Right. That he acts like Spider-Man, and that you're doing something that's a little more than just running the bases and telling me the same Spider-Man story that's been told every year for 60 years. You're bringing something additive to it and coming at it from a new direction and having something to say to push the character forward. And that's a balancing act. That's a rubber band, because you want to pull these characters and push them as far as they can go, but there's also a core center that they can never get too far from, and so you're constantly kind of going like this back and forth. With everything that you're doing, but nobody's looking to deliberately, smack into or overturn continuity. In general, every story follows all of the stories that came before him. But when you're talking about 60 or 80 years that were done by a variety of people with a variety of different needs and zeitgeists and moments and so forth, not everything can line up perfectly, and it never did. I worked on the Marvel Universe Handbook back in the 90s with Mark Grunwald, and people talk about that time and how rock solid the continuity was, and you have no idea how often Grunwald and I would turn to one another looking at some entry on some character, shrug our shoulders and decide, okay, it's going to be this. Because that was the best you could do to reconcile or square whatever circle there had been, because in one story Peter Parker was allergic to garlic, and in the other he eats a garlic pizza. You just make a choice. So it's impossible with 60 years of stories. You could do it, and there are some people that get really wound up in that, and what ends up happening is the continuity loses its proper place in the scheme of things. The continuity is there to support the stories. The stories are not there to support the continuity. And, there's a phenomenon, and Marvel did a lot of these in the 80s and 90s, what we call, comics about comics, or stories about stories, that are really they're not really stories, they're kind of like anal retentive cleanup of, there were a bunch of stories that said things, and we're going to reconcile all that and make all the rows nice and neat this week.
Yeah.
And there's like some fanish fun to be had with that. But that can't be the be all and end all of your story. That can't be what your goal is in and of itself. There'd better be a story in there that means something to an audience today, and that matters to somebody who's dropping their $3.99 on this month's issue of whatever comic you're talking about. It can't just be, hey, remember all those comics that we bought years ago? I've now arranged them in my long box in this precise order so that we can all enjoy them that way. Isn't that great? That's what the internet is for. The stories are there for the stories, and the continuity is there to help enrich the stories. If you can do a story that draws on something out of continuity, it's one of the things that Al Ewing does well in places like Immortal Hulk, where he refers to or brings back or references different stories in the past, but in doing so, they all feed into, here's the thing that he is building in this book. Then that's great, and that's what you want out of the experience. And as a reader, you think that's cool. Look, it's that guy from that issue that I read, in 1995, and that's super cool. I feel fulfilled. The money I spent in 1995 has reaped its benefit to me today, or whatever. Yeah. But it's not the whole enchilada.
Right.
And on that,
awesome.
Do you guys get like a giggle when you see, like, if, for instance, Al Ewing's Hulk? When people are like, well, the real Devil Hulk was actually in this issue of Hulk over here, and it goes skyrockets in price, and everybody's freaking out. Like, are you in the room at times with Al being like, can you believe what we just did, guys?
Again, that sort of thing is always kind of fun when it happens.
Yeah.
When that back issue price skyrockets, it doesn't really affect us one way or the other, because it's not like we see any of that money, and it's also not like years ago when I did that Devil Hulk issue, I stashed 500 copies in my garage that I'm now going to sell on eBay or anything. But that's cool. That just shows, hey, somebody's reading and paying attention, and now they're interested in this history and this background, and like they're seeking out this obscure issue of Hulk, issue 13, that we published years ago. And like they're into it, and both the thrill of the hunt and the feeling like some people hit the metaphoric jackpot. I bought that issue of Hulk back in 1998, and now it's worth $50. It's like getting a lottery ticket. All of that is part and parcel of being a comic book reader and collector, and for anybody that enjoys it and gets something out of that, that's terrific. It's not really where my focus is. But, for everybody that likes it, more power to you.
Yeah. Yeah, it's always a nice feeling, like when I bought the 10 years ago when I bought the first appearance of King Shark in that Superboy issue. And then to find out, like, last week it jumped in price. I'm like, see, you all laughed at me. You thought King Shark was silly, but here we are.
Again, when I was younger, I paid attention to that sort of stuff, and I would have that same elation.
Oh, yeah.
Despite the fact that I wasn't selling my comics.
Oh, I never sell them. No. I'll never sell them.
And so the fact that this one is suddenly worth $50, like, that's fun on an abstract level, but it's not like I have $50 in my wallet now,
Right.
and it's not like I'm going to sell the comic to get the $50. It's literally worth exactly the same thing it was worth the day before
Right.
as a comic in a box in my house.
It's true.
But again, if it makes you feel good, if you love the fact that you've got this thing now and it's more desired and you were there, again, all that's great.
Yep.
But it's there is definitely that sort of little mental disconnect of I'm not really selling my comics. So
no, never.
For people who are dealing in these things, it's excellent, and maybe it's a way for them to put some dollars in their cash register that they can then spend on next month's Marvel Comics, which is great. But again, it doesn't really impact on us making the books directly.
So let's talk about something that's a little more obscure, especially for like Avengers, and something kind of recent, like Avengers Mech Strike. Because I know when Chris and I had heard about it, we're like, oh my god! Like, and me not being a huge Marvel fan, like I said, but that was a book that I read because Avengers in mech suits was something that I wanted to read, but I have very simple taste and like giant robots, giant monsters. That's pretty much it. But so editing a book like that where there really isn't that much you can't do, right? I mean, it's there to be pure fun and enjoyment for a reader of like the Avengers are wearing mech suits. Like, what can you really constrain on the writer there? I mean,
I mean, for all that's a simple concept and kind of a goofy concept when you take it on a certain level. My approach doing that book, and the same thing is true, as I reached out and got Jed to do it and Carlos to do it, was we need to treat this like it's a real, in air quotes, a real, Marvel comic. It's a real issue of Avengers. So, there's kind of two ways you can do this sort of thing. You can kind of go, oh, it's a goofy thing that connects to this larger, merchandising initiative where there'll be toys and things, and it doesn't matter. Or you can go, this is just another issue of Avengers this month. This has got the same sort of gravitas and should have the same sort of drama and impact to it that a Marvel comic does.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm much more to prefer the second. So for us, we took it all just as seriously as we took that those month's issues of Avengers, and didn't play any less hard on making those 5 issues as exciting and dramatic and compelling as we could. And it seemed like by and large, people liked it, and people liked it maybe a little bit more than they thought they were going to when they heard the original idea. And that's part of the goal too, is always try to exceed expectations. Back in the day before it came out, every time people would hear about Young Avengers, they would all groan and go, "Oh, Young Avengers, that's the worst idea ever. Young Avengers, what the heck is that?" And so, when the book came out and people really loved it, that's a nice turnaround. And now, people are constantly going, "We want more. Where's more Young Avengers? We need more Young Avengers." That's what you're doing every time you're trying to do something like an Avengers Mech Strike, is do something that's more than people think it is, and that makes them want more of it more than they think that they're gonna.
And like you said, it definitely, I guess going into it, I wasn't expecting it to take itself so seriously as it did, but it also it elevated the story, like you said. And then even getting time travel involved and stuff like that had a little more weight to it. And you think that's kind of what elevated the story even more, is adding all these stakes and a higher level of you bring in a big bad villain, not to spoil anything too much, but but you think okay, having a real villain that's pretty relevant right now, and messing with time travel, and okay, oh yeah, someone an Avenger could die, that kind of elevates it and makes it more enjoyable for the reader.
Yeah, well, again, it just needs to have the same kind of drama and stakes that a Marvel comic typically has. It shouldn't feel like This is a term that doesn't really apply anymore, but it shouldn't feel like Saturday morning Avengers.
Okay. Yep.
You know what I mean? It shouldn't feel like it's the kid Avengers. No, it's the Avengers. They're having an adventure. In this adventure, they put on robot suits. Could you see a situation where they would put on robot suits in the Marvel Universe? Yes. Then this is one of those, and it's all fine. Like you go with it, and you don't worry about the derivation of it or the fact that there's some silliness to it. All superhero stories on some level are pretty silly, and it's only our own decisions about what we choose to care about that make some of this stuff dumber than other stuff in the public consciousness. So you decide what you're going to take seriously and not, and you go out and you play it as straight as you can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess it is all pretty silly at the end of the day, right?
Yeah, I remember having an argument. This is now years ago. This is when we were working up Avengers Disassembled, and part of Avengers Disassembled was that Hawkeye was going to get killed, and there was some argument back and forth over whether or not this was going to happen. And one of the arguments that was put to me was, well, Hawkeye is dumb because Hawkeye, it's like a guy with a bow and arrow, and he's fighting guys with machine guns, and that doesn't make any sense. That's stupid. And I had to say back at the time, like, explain to me how that's dumb, but a blind guy with a stick fighting guys with machine guns is cool. Because I can't tell the difference there. It's only dumb if you say it's dumb.
Right. If you say it out loud. Yeah.
The joke I always make, Daredevil being a character I adore, but the joke I always make is like, yeah, Daredevil, it's the blind guy with the superpower of sight.
Right.
Yeah, it's not dumb until you point out the absurdity out loud is when it becomes a problem.
Or until you decide that it's dumb.
Yeah,
you decide that it doesn't work. None of this stuff is real. Nobody sticks to walls. Nobody flies through the air. Nobody can create a compressed liquid that you mount on your wrist that will fire a line 60 feet away that will stick to a building that you can swing on and that evaporates in an hour. Yeah. It's all fantasy nonsense, but there's a buy-in. There's a common belief, that coming into this stuff, the buy-in to the story is you're going to believe that a blind guy can go out with a stick and fight some guys and win more often than not because he's just that good and he's got heightened senses and a radar sense and all this jazz. And you're going to believe that a guy with arrows can take on a bunch of guys with machine guns and win. It's part of the fantasy. It's part of the buy-in. Again, in my cynical fan days, I once wrote a thing that was called the most realistic Batman story ever. And it was about 3 pages long. And it was very much set up almost like the opening of the old 67 Spider-Man cartoon. So it's Batman, he's on top of a building, and down below there's like a jewelry store or something being robbed. So he pulls out his batarang with the bat rope and throws it, to the flagpole or a gargoyle or whatever the hell across the way, and then he reels it back up because he's missed, and he throws it again, and he wheels it back up, and eventually he gets it to stick, and he swings down. He's going to burst in and take them by surprise. He dislocates both of his shoulders. He smashes through the plate glass window, giving himself horrible cuts all over, and the guys inside, surprised by the crash, wheel on him and pelt him with bullets, turning him into a blood-ridden corpse. And that's more or less, even that's a heightened version of what would happen in real life.
Right.
But we don't want that.
Yeah, exactly.
So for all that we want these stories to be real, we want them to have verisimilitude. We want them to feel realistic. We want them to feel genuine. But we don't really want the reality. The reality stinks. James Bond doesn't win in the reality. James Bond isn't a good guy in the reality. But if I'm going to a 007 movie, I want to see him do everything.
Yeah. Exactly.
I want to see him surf on top of airplanes
Yep.
and parasail down with the Union Jack into a ski lift.
Yep.
And make time with the Snow Bunny.
Yep.
And none of that's going to happen in real life.
No, it's
that's
not.
why you go to see the movie.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
So on what you just said, and not to call out the distinguished competition, but how do you ever get that pitch where it's like, I'm going to do so and so, but in the real world? Because I've seen that pitch. It's now in previews currently at somewhere else. I won't say it, but I mean, do you get that? And do you have that same thought in your head? Like, no, that's dumb.
I think it all depends on how it's presented. Certainly, people have been deconstructing, superhero comics for at least 30 years now, and some of them do it very well and very intelligently. Partly because they know which bits to take apart and they know which bits not to take apart. And even that's an ever-changing thing. Somebody can always walk in tomorrow with a great idea that changes the board, and suddenly go, oh, that thing we would never do, we'll do that this time. We'll unmask Peter Parker as Spider-Man as part of the story because the larger story that we're telling makes sense, and there's value in doing that now. So yeah, I don't feel like people shouldn't try to make the characters seem realistic. I just think that there's a point beyond which, realistic isn't any fun at all.
Yeah.
and so they're not really making them realistic. They're making them more plausible or less, silly to the readers. One of the common things that comic book readers, particularly young ones, and by young I really mean like early teens, 10 to 16 years old, that sort of range, although it goes older and so forth. There is a certain self-loathing and a certain embarrassment that goes with liking this stuff, where you feel like, I can't tell anybody I like this because they'll all make fun of me and think I'm a kid and a jerk and so forth. And so any material that plays to them and says, no, this is going to be more serious and more real, and like you're not wrong for liking this. There's a real built-in appeal to that for that part of the audience, and that's not wrong. Like that's a completely valid expression of that.
Right.
But it's not the be-all and end-all. And at the same time, there's also a place for ridiculous flights of fancy where Batman fights an alien from outer space, along with his pal Space Ghost. Like
right.
you can do all of that, and none of it is individually right or wrong. There's true to the character and true to the history and the mythos, and there's not true. There's executed well and there's executed poorly. But these characters, particularly the ones that have lasted the test of time, are very flexible and infinitely adaptable to all sorts of stories and all sorts of storytelling, and they don't have to be one thing. Again, I'm backseat quarterbacking a little bit here, but I feel like that's, at least up until recently, that's been a big problem with the DC films, is that the people making them seem to be so concerned that anybody would laugh at them for telling stories about strong guys in tights, that they feel a need to double down on being nihilistic and apocalyptic and murderous and every other thing, all things that I don't necessarily associate by and large with DC as a brand or as a thing. And you can do some of that, but Batman is more than that, and Batman has been more than that, and trying to cut all of that stuff off and go, no, my Batman just uses guns and just kills people. But that's not, you're not really getting to the essence of what has made that character work over the years. Right. And again, in any given story, maybe there's a good point where Batman pulls out a gun and kills somebody. Much like Peter Parker, I don't tend to think I would find that story, but maybe it's there, and maybe it would be workable. But it's not the sum total of this stuff. But then again, it's very easy for me to sit here and say, "Oh, well, clearly the mistake they're making there is blah 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 blah."
Right.
They can come and say the same thing about all the books that I'm working on, and that's valid. I don't have to solve the problem of what's in Detective Comics next month. I got to solve the problem of what's in Avengers next month.
Yep. And I guess I was thinking about this while you were talking earlier about the absurdness and sometimes in comics, or when you like you say it out loud. Do you ever? Chris and I talk about comic book science all the time, where a writer will just and I think the biggest example for me was the Dark Knight's Metal run. That's DC, but there's a lot of comic book science, with the multiverse and the dark multiverse. And does a writer ever do you ever see a writer get a little too carried away with comic book science, where you're like, whoa, you got to either shape this a little more less complicated, or is it over complication?
Well, sure. I mean, at the point where I start falling asleep is the point where you've got too much of that.
Yeah.
And all of that stuff is great so long as you've got a compelling story with compelling characters that I care about and want to see, want to go through their struggles with them and want to see them, reach some sort of resolution. Again, one of the things I tell our editors all the time is that, our audience, is emotionally invested in these characters. They've read them for years. They think of them as their friends. They are more real to them than the people who are making the comics. And consequently, what that means is they will allow for the most egregious lapses in logic and common sense if they get the emotional payoff that they want. And that they're looking for. What they care about ultimately is what they feel when they're reading these books, whether that's excited or choked up or enthused, or whatever that emotional state change is. If they get that, they don't care how you get there. Whereas making sure that every nook and cranny of your impossible time travel plot logic is rock solid is nice, but if I don't care about who's traveling through time and why and what happens to them and what they learn or what they don't learn or what happens to them as a result of the choices they've made, it's all a waste. Nobody cares. I don't care how space travel works in Star Trek. I care about what's going on wherever the Enterprise has gotten to and what they're facing with and how it's all reflective of the human condition, despite the fact that everybody has bumps on their heads.
Exactly. Okay.
These are kind of interconnected, but I guess first, how does the decision come to make a book an event book, as opposed to let's take Heroes Reborn. It's very recent. Hopefully everybody out there's read it because it was awesome. But instead of making that just another 7 issues of Avengers, why make that its own thing as opposed?
Well, every one of those is slightly different as well.
Yeah.
Theoretically, every year we're looking to do at least one event, and sometimes more like 2 or 3. Some of them are more family events that are here's a Spider-Man thing, or here's an X-Men thing, whatever. Here's a Carnage thing, so we're always on the lookout for that, and we're kind of often planning 2 or 3 years ahead.
Mm-hmm.
That we, in a broad sense, I kind of know what the Marvel Universe is going to look like 2 years from now. Not every single thing in every single book, but broadly I kind of have an understanding. And the further out you go, the sketchier it gets, but we start to build. And so there are often things that are bubbling up in the books that naturally we look at and go, oh, this could be a bigger thing than what it was. That Heroes Reborn event, that was originally just going to be Avengers. When Jason pitched it, and in fact, even when he wrote the first issue, that was just Avengers 45, I think it was. And the idea was, okay, we'll do, the rest of the books there is one shots. There won't be an Avengers next month. There'll be a Hyperion one shot and a Nighthawk one shot and a whatever, and then eventually we'll come back with Avengers 56 and finish up the story. And as we were getting closer to that, and as we were going to our 2 or 3 times a year summits, and Jason was talking about what he was doing and this new world he was building and so forth, people were excited by it, and people saw the opportunities in it because, while we are going to explore and touch on a wide range of stuff in all the issues that Jason did, there were still plenty of things that were like, there's a reference in that one panel to something that sounds cool, or there's a flashback to a thing there. This seems like it could be bigger than it is, and so at a certain point we said, hey, what if instead of doing this as 2 issues of Avengers, we blow it out as Heroes Reborn, make a bigger deal out of it. That'll give us some bandwidth on the side to do a number of one shots that can explore and have fun with some of this stuff that's sitting there ready to go. And that seems like it'll have value. Plus, this will come as a shock to you. We like to sell comics because when we sell comics, we make money, and when we have the money, that lets us make more comics. It's kind of a cycle thing.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
and
sense.
So,
almost like a business, right? Like
yes, exactly. So, I mean, at any given point, obviously, we're looking for what will be exciting to people, what will bring them into the stores on a regular basis. So Heroes Reborn, we've got these things. They're going to come out weekly. It's a weekly thing. And so if you're reading it week to week as opposed to as a collection, that's a good reason to go to your local comic shop every week. Hey, the next issue of Heroes Reborn is going to be out. And, while I'm there, I'll pick up Iron Man 2. And maybe I'll pick up The Flash as well, which isn't bad. It still puts dollars into that retailer's hands. See you next week. I got to come back for issue 3 because I'm invested in this ride. So it's a combination of all of these things.
Yeah.
Every once in a while, there's just, and I had this conversation literally last week. We were looking ahead to a given period, and we don't have anything there. And so the conversation was, hey, is there anything going on in the world of Avengers that could be a thing there? And I've since gone back and talked to a couple of people, creatively about things that we have percolating that maybe could come up. And we're starting to build a thing. And I can't say anything about it. This is all brand new, and you won't see it for at least a year, if not longer. And that thing is right now, it's just a formless blob of half-baked ideas that different people that I've spoken to have had. But as we continue to talk and refine them, that could be a thing. That's a whole big event. Or as we're playing with this, we could stumble on something that could be bigger. And the opposite happens too. There was a thing we were going to do as a bigger event that also hasn't happened yet, so I can't get into it. And that we decided at a certain point would be better served keeping it within the title that it was growing out of, rather than making it a thing outside of that. You're always reacting to what the marketplace and what the audience seems to be feeling at a given point. When they think there's too much or when there's not enough. You always want to do things that are exciting and that get comic book readers energized and going to the stores and picking up the books every week. Or, if they're reading them as collections, scarfing up the collections as they drop. Or if they're reading them on Marvel Unlimited, really excited 3 months after the guys that were picking them up every week.
Yep.
Or whatever. Like, you always want there to be something new that's going on that's exciting in our world, and that's driving interest in the stories that we're making.
And I guess similar to that, but hopefully a little bit of a different answer. Is there ever been a time, or is in the future, could there be a time where like you yourself or like the world is ready to bring back this character? Like, the world is ready. We need a Spot series, everybody. Let's get the Spot back in the spotlight and do it. And you push it and get it through.
Yeah.
If so, I want a Spot series.
That's kind of every week and every month.
Yeah.
Okay.
Not to put too fine a point on it, but I'm not the be all and end all. But on most weeks, I'll pitch projects and they'll become projects. Whether they're ideas that I have or whether they're ideas that creators have. A creator came to me last week with an idea for a thing that we had talked about a little bit. That's going to be a project now. So, and sometimes it's just me inventing stuff or hearing about a need. The whole reason that was a Squirrel Girl book was me coming out of some meeting we had and going to our head of sales, David Gabriel, and going, David, I think I want to do a Squirrel Girl book. And David went, okay. And so we made it. I didn't end up editing that book. Will Moss did, and he did a much better job than I would have. So I was happy that he to let him at it. But that was just me going, oh, there's a moment, there's a zeitgeist, there's a particular need for something, and these other guys are trying to fill it by doing X, Y, and Z. But I think the right thing to do here would be to make a Squirrel Girl comic.
You're right.
And so we did. That happens all the time.
Okay. So why not the Spot? Like...
Well,
that's awesome.
My simplest get out of jail free answer there is, the Spot's kind of a Spider-Man character, so that's more in Nick Lowe's wheelhouse to figure out than mine. He's dealing with all things
you
Spider-Man.
You got the wrong editor here.
All right, yeah, you send him my way then. We got to talk. I got his first appearance up here for a reason.
I want to get back into the life story because that was something I really enjoyed as not being a huge Marvel fan, especially the Fantastic Four life story. But that's like, I mean, we talked about it earlier that you want to, you could edit a book and not worry about continuity from, a issue that happened in the 70s. But I mean, we're telling every decade of story for these characters, and who chooses what to highlight and what not to talk about, or what to talk about with specific characters. And
well, see, that project and the project that came before it, Spider-Man Life Story, that's a pretty good example, because that was an idea that had been pitched to me in one way, shape, or form a number of times over the years by a number of people. Okay. And at different points, we just either couldn't crack it well enough story-wise, or couldn't crack it commercially, or couldn't figure it out. The earliest one I remember talking with, I think Roger Stern and I talked about doing a similar sort of thing around 1999 that would have been called Marvel Age. And the basic idea of all of those life story projects is the characters exist in real time. Clearly, the Marvel heroes do not age the way normal human beings do, because they've got 60 years behind them and none of them are 60 years old. But what if they did? And that's the premise. It wasn't really until Chip started to pitch that. Chip Zdarsky, who did Spider-Man Life Story, and even there, he was pitching it the same sort of way. It's the Marvel Universe, but it moves in real time and so forth, and we couldn't crack it. And it wasn't really until Darren Shan, who's one of our editors, said, well, you should do that, but just do it with Spider-Man or something. And the light bulb went on over my head, and I went, that's it. That's the way to do it. You got to limit it to just one thing, and then you're not, even as it was, the Spider-Man Life Story and the Fantastic Four Life Story, those are bigger than normal books. They're 30 pages rather than 20 every issue, because there's just so much stuff to fit in, so they're hard to do. But you could limit it that way, and that would make it manageable. And we did Spider-Man Life Story, and Chip and Bags, Mark Bagley, did that, and it did very, very well. And so the idea of coming back and doing another one, it came up, and the trick to me was then, okay, how do I do this again and not make it the same story? Because the 60s are still the 60s, and the 70s are still the 70s, and my answer to that, partly was, well, there's a Fantastic Four anniversary, this year.
Yep.
And the other was Spider-Man's a single character, the Fantastic Four are a team, but they're a family unit, and so that moving forward in time, you can see playing out differently than the events of a Spider-Man. And then, so in terms of what's actually touched on or how it's arranged and so forth, that's all up to the individual writers. So if you're liking Fantastic Four Life Story, that's all Mark Russell and Sean Isaacs who's drawing it. But Mark, kind of put together the thing. It was Will Moss's idea to reach out to him as somebody when I was looking for a writer on the FF Life Story, because Chip didn't want to do it again, having done it once with Spider-Man and feeling like he couldn't do enough to make it a different story in his own mind. And Mark Russell had done a bunch of really cool things at a bunch of places, and I thought, okay, that could be a guy that would have an interesting take on the FF, and so he's laid out the story and put it that evolution of time, and pared things down or pared things away, and the history there doesn't really match the publishing history, and not to the same extent certainly that Chip's did. Chip's Spider-Man life story matched it a lot more one-to-one.
Mhm.
Whereas in Fantastic Four life story, like, you don't even get Doctor Doom until issue 2, which is in the 70s,
Right.
and everybody's waiting for Galactus to show up.
Mhm.
Which hasn't happened yet by the current issue that's out. So we're not just like taking the 60 years of comics and going that one, that one, that one, that one, that one. You're taking all of the events and taking the idea of these characters are growing through history. Okay, so if Johnny Storm is 16 in 1961 when he gets his powers, then he's 26 in 1971, and he's 36 in 1981, and he's 46 in 1991.
Yeah.
And how does that, people change over time. How do those relationships change? How does that situation change? Plus, it's a bottle universe, which basically means I can do anything I want to any of the characters. And by I really mean, Mark and Sean.
Yeah.
So I don't have to worry about there being another book the next month. So, you have ultimate freedom to explore, all aspects of these characters. One of the things years ago that Alan Moore had theorized in talking about comics and superheroes, and Alan Moore, it was a very smart, very sharp guy. He said that the difference between superheroes and what we think of as classic mythology is classic mythology, mythological stories. We all know the endings. If you're reading about the Norse gods, you know that Ragnarok comes and they're finished. We know how Robin Hood dies. Mm-hmm. We know what happens at the end of Camelot. We know that Arthur is laid to rest, and yada yada. Superhero stories are always the middle. Superhero stories are always, it's Spider-Man, and next month he's going to fight somebody again, and on and on and on you go on this treadmill. There's never a conclusion. So anytime you can do a project like the life stories where you can give the characters a conclusion, you at least have the potential of, tapping into that idea of them as mythology.
And I think the awesome part about Mark Russell doing that book, because we've had him on the show too, and he hasn't done a whole lot for Marvel, but he knows how to handle like characters in a political environment as well, and the whole the Cold War issue that just came out and stuff like that. He's really good at having Mr. Fantastic as like a kind of like what would his choices be in an era like that, and I thought that was really cool, and I knew something like that was coming, because of just how he writes and how good he is. Like Chris and I talk about him all the time, but I think it really fits well with those characters.
Well, thank you. Like I say, the trick, and I see and understand this a little more now, having done 2 of them. The trick with these really is that the first issues are always the least interesting because they have to be.
Right.
Because if you're in the 60s with Spider-Man or the Fantastic Four, well, that's when they were created, and that's where most of this stuff happened the first time. So they're not terribly different in terms of their trajectory. It's very hard to show where that journey is going to take you in that initial installment. And which is why on both of those books, when the first issue came out, people kind of went, well, that's it. I don't know what this. But once you started to get to issues 2 and 3, where the characters were getting older and events could diverge a little more or get a little more cataclysmic, people really see it and go, oh, I get it now. And that's kind of why I feel like the Spider-Man life story works really well, now that it's done as a collection. Like, you could just give that book to anybody who knows Spider-Man, and you start from the front and you go to the back, and you don't have to read anything else, and there's a full story of Spider-Man's life. And hopefully the Fantastic Four will be the same kind of way. That said, for all that's a full story of Spider-Man's life, we have a Spider-Man life story annual dropping in like a week or 2 that Chip and Mark did, because when I talked to Chip about doing Fantastic Four, he didn't have he didn't feel he could do that, but he had a thing that he had wanted to do in Spider-Man, but it got squeezed out for space, and so we decided we would do an annual. It was a series that was popular. People liked it, so them coming back and doing one more special seemed like something that the audience would respond to.
Do you guys see that as a brand? Like, could we expect possibly like Captain America life story and so on and so forth?
I think so, up to a point. Like, one of the things that Marvel in particular has been very bad at over the years is it's like the gold rush. Anytime anybody finds anything that works, we do a lot of it.
Mm-hmm.
Like if suddenly like we do one project of whatever, The End, and it does well, suddenly there's 20 of them.
Yeah.
And we beat the heck out of it. And so, do I want to do or see more life story projects done? Yes, but only if they have something additive to offer to the Marvel Universe and are not just kind of like, well, we think we can sell it, and it's just kind of the same thing, except put a Hulk mask on Peter Parker, and it's the same.
Yeah,
it's the same story.
Mm-hmm.
So, but yes, the whole idea of coming up with any of this stuff really is to create things that have lasting equity and that can be things that go on. Hopefully one day, maybe somewhere in film or streaming or television or whatever, thought broadcasts, studios one day can do a Spider-Man life story project.
Mm-hmm. That'd be cool.
and find their version of whatever that is. And so that's something that, you made up out of nowhere. That could be a thing that a lot of people do. Certainly, Roy Thomas came up with What If in the 70s, and now there's a show. And that's neat.
Yeah, it's awesome. It's really cool. And
so,
yeah, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Mike. Go ahead.
So that brings up I know we've taken a lot of your time here, but one more question for me, and that's when you brought up the What If thing, and I noticed Marvel does this, DC does this. If there's a show or a movie coming out, they really want to show off a character, like Black Widow gets a new #1 or something like that.
Kate Bishop has a book coming out along with Hawkeye. Series.
Yeah, Kate. Like before we did this interview, we were talking about like Hawkeye, and like I'm really excited. I mean, we're excited for a Kate Bishop book, but not necessarily a Hawkeye book. But how much of a push is that? And are you guys? Do you just pick a writer? You say, hey, we got to do this character. Like someone needs to grab this character, or is there someone that comes to you and is like a writer really wants to do it, and it seems like a good time to do that? Obviously, you're in the business to make money, but
right. Well, there's two things with that. The first thing is that in all of our interactions with Marvel Studios, and the guys over there who do the films and do the television, our mandate and our understanding. We've talked with Kevin about this. We do regular meetings with them every X number of months too, that are now Zoom meetings. So I haven't had to fly to the West Coast in a while. Where we kind of lay out, here's all the stuff we have going on, and they kind of lay out, here's all the stuff they have going on, and they're very consistent in their messaging, which is they don't want us to just be doing what they're doing. They want us to do the stuff that they can do 3 years from now.
Right. Right.
No.
So on the one hand, it doesn't help them necessarily if they have an Eternals movie coming out for us to do an Eternals book that's exactly like it. What could help them is for us to do an Eternals book that they could look at and go, hey, there's an idea in it right there that could be Eternals 2 or Eternals 3. So, our Marvel Comics as a publishing entity is always kind of meant to be the tip of the spear. We're supposed to be the furthest out there and generating just tons of stuff that they can then kind of comb through and find the bits that appeal to them and work for their model and their medium and build those versions of. The flip side of that though is nobody involved is stupid, and like you just said, a Hawkeye show is coming and you're kind of intrigued and you're kind of interested in it. The best time on earth to launch a Hawkeye book is probably right now.
Yeah, exactly.
So we look at those opportunities and go, this is probably a good time to do an Eternals book. So let's do that. Yeah. This is probably a good time to do a Black Widow book. And so, we certainly sit down and go, okay, we should probably try and get a Hawkeye project mounted around this point. But the intention isn't just to go, we're going to duplicate whatever the show is. We want to do something that's additive and something that's forward-looking. That again, if they do a second season or a third season of that show, maybe there's something in what gets done now that becomes the thing that they use there. Or if they take Kate Bishop into other studios projects or whatever. Yeah. So it's not really one or the other. Like, it's a really symbiotic sort of relationship. But nobody's ever saying, you gotta do. It's just it's such low-hanging fruit. You'd be stupid not to do it.
Right.
In the same sort of way that, DC has a Suicide Squad movie out. DC has big ads in their book. Here's all the Suicide Squad, one-shots and projects we have, and here's the collections and so forth. Why? Because at this moment, everybody is going to be talking and thinking about Suicide Squad.
Exactly.
So of course you do that.
Right.
It just makes sense. And so yeah, it is a little from column A, a little from column B.
Okay.
So, as Mike said, you've been super generous with your time, but I do want to give one moment to something non-Marvel that you're doing. Obviously, we could spend our 3 hours probably telling you about Marvel stuff. But you have your website, tombrevoort.com, where you're doing a lot of cool stuff. Tell everybody out there what that's all about, what you're doing over there.
Well, that's just, that's just me having fun mostly. I do a bunch of different pieces over there. I write on it virtually every week. Usually on the weekends, I'll do a number of stories. Sort of the spine of it is the history of comics, which is my history of comics. Where I started with the first comics that I bought, and I've gone sort of chronologically every week and added other comics that I bought when I bought them, in the order I bought them, and looking back at them and dissecting them. Just earlier today, I wrote a piece on a random issue of Brave and the Bold with Batman and Aquaman.
Yeah, I read that.
A comic I haven't looked at since I bought it in 1978, I think.
Yeah.
I also do things that are a little more historical based. Looking at back at the history and trying to dissect particularly the early Marvel books. So I've done pieces on sort of taking apart Fantastic Four #1 and Amazing Fantasy 15 and some of the history and behind the scenes stuff. I also tend to excavate a lot of forgotten stuff. There are a lot of other publishers or smaller outfits from the 60s, 70s, and 80s who were sort of trying to do their best versions of Marvel or compete with Marvel or just do something interesting, and so I highlight a lot of that stuff. Every once in a while there'll be television that I like and want to write about. So, there'll be a bunch of articles on Have Gun Will Travel or Doctor Who or Star Blazers or whatever. So it's just a central clearinghouse for all the stuff that I've got.
Awesome.
And what about TBTV? Are you still doing that, or has that kind of reached its...
I'm still playing with it, although I sort of plateaued a little bit, and the reason for that was I started it up as a YouTube channel, and the reason I did it, being perfectly frank, was I had done a piece at the tombrevoort.com, a written piece, and in my travels, 6 or 9 months later, I found that somebody had pretty much taken that piece and turned it into a video, and that's fine. Like, I don't own, any of this stuff. Good on them. But they had way more engagements than I did. And so I kind of looked at that and went, well, if they're going to get, 30,000 hits or whatnot, I want people to read the actual piece I did and not somebody's interpretation of it. Right. So maybe there's a thing to be done here. And so I experimented for a couple of weeks doing videos at the TBTV address on YouTube. Some of which were adaptations of things that were written pieces, some of which were new, some of which were me adapting the talk I give to the Marvel editors over a course of a bunch of weeks. And what I found there, at least during the month and a half or so that I did it, was it took a lot of time, and I didn't actually get more hits than I did doing the website. So, I haven't found yet found the secret to either making the algorithm break me through all the clutter that's out there, or just finding the one engagement with somebody where they would share or retweet. Or circulate something I'd done that suddenly it would pop and explode, and there'd be a lot more humans there. So that's kind of been the hang up till now. Like, they take longer to do than the written pieces, and I get the same result, which kind of makes me go, well, I'll do 2 written pieces in the time I would do one of those. But there've been enough people who've asked about it that I'm likely to take another stab at it at some point here. Because I've got everything set up, it's all there, and it really is. Everybody on Earth has a YouTube channel.
Oh yeah,
and competing with all the people on Earth, I'm not really that fast or that sharp.
Well, as somebody who does this on a regular basis, I can tell you that my Facebook, my Instagram, all that is filled with these ads that tell me if I just give somebody $1,000, they'll give me the keys to the car. So apparently that's all you need is just a couple $1,000.
Yeah, that's all you need. Yeah.
What you really need is to be the one putting those ads on everybody's page.
Yeah, that's what you need.
Because then I'd have the $1,000 and I wouldn't care about the people watching the video.
Tom, thanks so much for your time. We'd love to have you back sometime.
Sure, definitely.
We got so much stuff to talk about. Thank you again. Such a pleasure. And we'll have the link for everybody for your website in the show notes.
Great.
Yes. And are you on Twitter or anything like that you want to pimp out?
Oh yeah. I'm relatively easy to find. I'm on Twitter as Tom Brevoort. I'm on Facebook as Tom Brevoort.
Nice.
On Tumblr, I can be found as Tom Brevoort. On Instagram, I think it's a little different. I think it's like TMB 11779. But I'm sure if you search Tom Brevoort there, I'll come up.
Okay.
I'm a master of subterfuge when it comes to the social arts.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Tom.
So yeah, thanks so much. And remember the spot, dupe. We need these books.
Okay, all right. Very good. I'll get right on that.
Okay.
All right.